We are live. Can you give me a thumbs up, Kathleen, if you can hear me? Thanks so much. Hey, everybody, welcome to our event. Good evening, one and all. Just really a warm welcome to A Prophet is Not Known in Her Town, Conversations on Visionary Women, a two-day symposium where we will engage in conversations on visionary women with the help of some pretty visionary women themselves, who come from a variety of perspectives and locations. My name is Michael Murphy, and I direct the Hank Center here at Loyola in Chicago. Well, I'm not really at the Hank Center right now, unfortunately. I am like you, strewn out about the land, dispersed. We are people of in the diaspora. In any case, blessings to you tonight, and warm health. It really is my pleasure to extend a warm greeting to you, and to also welcome you to our gathering on behalf of the Hank family. With their generous donation that makes our operation move. Also, on behalf of the Gannon Center for Women in Leadership, and thanking Director Gabrielle Buckley and Diane Zazicki for their support. And then also the Provost Office, particularly, and University Leadership, we welcome you. I also, on behalf of our Hank Center staff, would like to extend a kind welcome. And I want to thank them for their consistently excellent work. Our center manager, Megan Toomey, our graduate student assistant, who I just got some help from, Kathleen McNutt, and of course our stalwart undergraduate assistants, Catherine and Francis. Thanks so much. So while I have you here, of course, please check our webpage out and get a sense of what we do. We have a variety of programming. We support research. We do a lot of different things to demonstrate what a living tradition we have in this this precious Catholic intellectual artistic tradition. So, and social, there's so much more, as you well know. So give us a good look. A couple events coming up shortly. Next week we have Jerome Baggett and Kaya Oakes and Paul Lakeland looking at secularism and faith in dialogue, looking at agnostic moves, the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S nuns, and dialoguing with atheism. Should be really interesting. That's next Thursday. And then down the line, we have a Faith in Focus featuring the two popes. And then we have some two events that will celebrate, interrogate Pope Francis' thought. One on Laudato Si at 5 and the technocratic paradigm, basically. And then we're gonna have a great panel on looking at Fratelli Tutti, which for many is an unfortunate title, but check Carmen Nanco Fernandez's article in Commonwealth today, and I think it sheds some good light on why Francis uses the language he does there. So please join us. That's October 15th and 16th. Okay, there are many sayings of Jesus recorded in the Gospels that energize our spirits and lighten our hearts. Somehow, a prophet is not known in a prophet's town is not one of them. The declaration is translated in many ways, as we have seen, but the essence is never lost. And it's a saying that rightfully, in some ways, fills us with shame. Or it should, I think, anyway, because it awakens our conscience. Like many self-evident truths, the phrase speaks volumes in its pithy 10-word construction. It contains so much about who we are and who we could be if we dare hear its wisdom, dare to do the hard work that it demands that we do. Why is it that we do not honor the prophets who walk among us? Why, what would it take to crack the sclerosis of our own egos so that we might hear the truth that they tell us daily? Why are we afraid of what we know to be true? We will ask questions like these over the next 2 days, and may all assembled here, all of our participants, and there are many of them, may we all have ears to hear. The symposium, with its specific trajectory, was a long time in the making. It's something that we wanted to do for a while. The prophetic voice is, it's just so important, and it always calls to us, quite obviously. We're so honored that this group of women scholars and thinkers and actors have accepted our invitation, and all come with various expertise and life experience. We will hear words of edification, support, and consolation, and we will be challenged by words of indictment, critique, and excoriation indeed. For this is the prophetic spirit, and the prophetic spirit makes demands on us in order that we may wake up, get real, and get to work. You know, I do miss being present with people. It's for me, I need people, and I draw life. So the proximity is very important. But I was speaking today with our staff, and Kathleen pointed out, Megan and Kathleen and I were talking about this, that there really could be, there's a lot gained from the Zoom space as well. There could be more focus, a way to listen more in a different way than you might. And then oftentimes you're with a family member, or you're making dinner. It has a podcast quality. So there's always something to learn. And so let's make the best of our Zoom time together and find its inner music. So now, we are so pleased to begin our proceedings with a keynote by Sister Carol Zinn, Dr. Carol Zinn, SSJ. Sister Carol, I'll refer to her in this segment. Thank you, Sister, for accepting our invitation. And it's been a delight to correspond with you these last months. We had some great COVID conversations, and Sister Carol is just, I really think we're in for a treat tonight. I want to also thank Dr. Mara Brecht as well for agreeing with enthusiasm to serve as a respondent to Sister Carol. So a little bit about the program, then we'll begin. After I read a little bit of bio just for introductions, and you can refer to our landing page for more information, Sister Carol will speak for about 45 minutes. And then Mara, Dr. Brecht will respond, and we will have, after that, 25 to 30 minutes for Q&A. The chat you'll see is disabled in this webinar mode of Zoom. So please utilize the Q&A function for any question or comment you might have. Megan and I are going to be putting these together, and Megan and I will engage and read off the questions and engage Sister Carol and Dr. Brecht, at the appointed time. Excuse me. So without further ado, Dr. Carol Zinn, a sister of St. Joseph from Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, has ministered the formal and non-formal education profession for many years. Ministered in, I should say. She has taught on all levels, pre-K through postgraduate, and has worked in the areas of educational leadership, religious education, sacramental coordinator, and music minister. Dr. Zinn has a wide-ranging skill set and vast experience. She participated in UN meetings on the topics of human rights, eradication of poverty, environment, peace and disarmament, education, sustainable development, women, children, and healthcare. She also spent time with individual congregations and provinces in helping them connect their particular efforts and energies to the global issues and concerns. Dr. Zinn served on her congregation's leadership team and as the senior vice president for mission integration for Plant Moran Cressa Company, working with congregations as they discern the future of their mission and charism and the fully living of religious life during these transformational times. Currently, Carol serves as the executive director of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. So welcome in a moment, Carol, Sister Carol, to our midst. And a warm welcome to Dr. Mara Brecht. And kind of rough, Mara's kind of new to Loyola, and with all this COVID interruption, we haven't had a chance to, we've met one time, but I want to welcome you to Loyola, Mara. We're so glad you're here. And Mara, Dr. Brecht, is an associate professor of theology at Loyola Chicago. Her research addresses Christian faith formation in contexts of racial and religious diversity, pedagogy, and the philosophy of Catholic education, as well as religious belonging in culturally hybrid contexts, most especially the context of Catholic higher education. So without further ado, we welcome Sister Carol Zinn to our midst. And Carol, thanks so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that very generous introduction. And I always like to follow an introduction like that with a sentence that simply says, if my dear mother were here sitting next to me, she would say, that's all well and good, Mike. Now you sit down and I'm going to tell them who she really is. And who she really is someone who wants to come to this conversation also. I do not come as any expert. I come as someone searching, remaining faithful to the call, and very, very grateful for the invitation to be here. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to all of you also. I'd like to thank all the people who are helping, Megan and Kathleen, and certainly my partner, my sister, Mara, who will join me a little later. So I've been invited to be with you tonight on this conversation about prophets not being known in their own town, in her own town, conversations on visionary women. And as always, we are mindful that we sit in our faith traditions, many of us sitting in a Christian Catholic tradition, Jewish tradition perhaps, and the scriptures surround us from last Sunday to today to this coming Sunday. Last Sunday, of course, we heard that wonderful story where, the owner, the vineyard owner says, are you envious because I'm generous? Because those who were last hired actually got paid the same as the first hired. Wonderful insight about our own journey, about using our prophetic voice, whether it's recognized or not. And are we envious because God is generous with others or with us? Today, of course, in the Hebrew scriptures, part of the psalm of today says to prosper the work of our hands for us, prosper the work of our hands. And isn't that what we want to be able to do in our world and with and for each other to help move forward the kingdom of God? And of course, on tomorrow, the second day of your symposium, wonderful question in the gospel, where Jesus says, who do the crowds say that I am? And then, of course, he says, who do you say that I am? That's the question for the prophet. Who do you say that I am? And then on Sunday, we always kind of bring around to, fulfilling the Sunday to Sunday kind of bookends, if you will, in our sacred scriptures. And this coming Sunday, we will hear again in the psalm that we beg with the psalmist that God will teach us the ways of God, teach us those paths. And so as we begin tonight, what I'd like to do is invite us that in addition to scripture, I'd like us to listen to a piece of music by Carrie Newcomer. And the name of it is If Not Now. And I think it speaks to the challenge that is ours when we try to discern what really is ours to do now, sitting in these scriptures and realizing that we are called to be a presence in the world. I think Carrie Newcomer has something to say to us as we begin tonight. So let's listen and enjoy. I think there isn't any sound, Kathleen.
If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may if not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. This moment, never see this moment or place and time again. If not now, tell me when. I see sorrow and trouble in this land. I see sorrow and trouble in this land. Although there will be struggle, we'll make the change we can. If not now, if not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment, place and time again. If not now, if not now, tell me when. I may never see the promised land. I may never see the promised land. And yet we'll take the journey and we'll walk it hand in hand. If not now, if not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment, a place and time again. If not now, if not now, tell me when. We'll work until it's done. Every daughter, every son, and every soul that's ever longed for something better, something brighter. And it will take a change of heart for this to mend. It will take a change of heart for this to mend. But miracles do happen every shining now and then. If not now, if not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when. We may never see this moment, a place and time again. If not now, tell me when. And miracles do happen every shining now and then. If not now, tell me when. If not now, tell me when.
Thanks very much, Kathleen. I think part of the energy for me in that piece of music by Carrie is that question, if not now, tell me when. That is the prophetic question. And so as we ask tonight, what really is ours to do, we're mindful that we're part of a very, very big story, universe story. And we're also part of a very specific story. These are just some things in history that have happened on September the 24th. You can see all the way back to the 4th century, we had another pope end his papal reign. You can kind of glance through that list. I just pulled some things out on today's calendar over the years, and I was very taken at some of those things that are listed there, like the U.S. Congress Post Office in 1789, the U.S. Federal Judiciary Act and a 6-person Supreme Court today, September 24, 1789. The U.S. Attorney General Office created September 24, 1789. And of course, now towards the end of the list, we also see that there was a federal execution of Christopher Andre Villalba tonight, September 24th, 2020. And we meet to begin this symposium tonight, September 24th. So what really is ours to do is to be a prophetic voice in our time. So even though we live in a very large world, we are somewhere specific. I love this picture. Reminds me of, where your feet are is really important.
May I interrupt you? I can't see your screen. Would you mind screen sharing?
Oh,
Again,
thank you.
you're welcome.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for telling me that. All these lovely pictures that I have. Okay, thanks. How's that, Mara? Is that good? Thanks. So one of the things I love about this picture is while we're in a large universe, we are exactly someplace in the universe. I love this picture. Reminds me of, you know, the detail of our daily life, like somebody has to make the coffee. Prophets make coffee too. And I think the other piece is to remember that we are in fact somewhere in that large galaxy. And that somewhere right now is surrounded by an incredible reality of the coronavirus. Hard to imagine that something so intriguing looking and somewhat beautiful has such impact. We're also living in a time in this particular country of incredible social, racial unrest. And so the question for us in that context, because that's something about a prophet. Prophet is always grounded in the context of their day. So it's really important if we're going to have conversations, visionary conversations about what really is ours to do, we have to be grounded in the reality of the day. So I'd like to just share tonight a couple of reflections about prophetic, political, personal, and peripheral. How do we be prophetic? Meaning, how do we offer a word of hope? Because in fact, we probably are not going to be able to stem the tide of the tsunamis that are coming our way, any more than the prophets themselves from various faith traditions were able to stem the tide. What they were able to do is to speak another word, speak a word of hope. Political, of course, I'm using in this way, the way prophets use it, and that is influence, not partisan. The personal and peripheral is the relationship between our interior selves and our exterior selves. So our inner work also has to be prophetic and political if our external work is going to be prophetic and political. The core, I think, of the work of the prophet is to really pay careful attention to the common good. Prophets are rarely concerned about themselves other than to say, the common good is my good. And so, of course, they're always pointing to something larger than themselves. And it's just this little thumbnail definition of common good. Whenever I use this, I usually ask people to think, from where did I get this definition? So I'm going to ask you to think that too. The common good is made up of three parts. One is that it's the sum total of all the social conditions that provide a full or a meaningful life. Prophets are always concerned about people who do not have the sum total of the social conditions, you know, nutrition, healthcare, shelter, education, employment, whatever those social conditions are. Doesn't have to be Cadillac level, but it does have to be the level by which people are able to live a meaningful, purposeful life. The second characteristic of the definition of the common good is that I, as an individual, I have choices. I mean, there's lots of choices. And I also have choices within limits. And the third part of the definition of the common good is that the focus is always on the group or always on the whole entity, whatever it might be. And the reason for that's so important is because if the common good of the group, species of any kind, if the common group is not maintained, the group ceases to exist. So it's some pretty heavy duty content for the common good. And since we're not in person, I won't ask you who you think this definition came from, but it's actually the definition of common good in the Revised Catholic Catechism. So it's not from socialism, it's not from Marxism, it's not from communism, it's from the gospel. And so when we talk about the common good, we're talking about someone who's able to be an authentic presence. Authentic having to do with being emotionally appropriate. Imagine that, you know, could just stop probably for the rest of tonight and just think about how emotionally appropriate I am, you are, we are, so forth. Emotionally appropriate, significant, purposive, and a responsible mode of human life. And again, I would just stop right there for myself and just go away for a week practically and just think about my own authentic presence. But prophets are those whose presence is authentic. They are always about building the beloved community. which many of us first heard from Martin Luther King. But the beloved community is much more aligned to Martin Buber's concept of I thou, that the relationship between each of us needs to be a sacred, holy relationship, like the relationship between I and thou. Whoever the thou is, for most of us, the thou's name is God. And then, of course, the third characteristic is choosing vulnerability. Now, in this culture, this is a real stretch, because people read that and say, I'm not going to be a doormat for anybody, and so forth. What that really means is that we choose to live in such a way that we have the capacity to be open to all that life brings us. In other words, we resist spraying ourselves with Teflon and only let some stuff impact us in life. So what I want to try and show here is that when the prophet looks at what's the word of hope to speak, what's the influence to have, what they're really looking at is the common good. And they make sure that they understand the common good starts with themselves as an authentic presence. Their work is about relationships that are sacred and holy, and that they don't spray themselves with Teflon. So that's why prophets are not welcome in their own town. First and foremost is because it's pretty challenging to be around them in their own town. So then what really is ours to do if we're going to try to bring this kind of presence to the world? Well, I'd like to share with you tonight my reflections on that by telling you 3 stories. Since this symposium is about conversations, visionary conversations about women, these are 3 stories, each about women, and they each pull out what I think is the work that we need to do if in fact we are going to be this prophetic presence in the world that is so desperately in need of a word of hope, of authentic presence, and of people who are trying to build a beloved community. So the 3 stories are about moving from courage from compassion, commitment from contemplation, and conviction from consciousness. First story. This is Mary. She's 7 years old. And she is a really, really good little girl. In fact, she goes to, Sunday school and is learning about how to be generous and compassionate and so forth. So her mother gave her something to put out in the garage one day, and she was gone a very long time. Her mother got really worried, so she went outside and looked all around for her. She was nowhere to be found. And just as the mother was pretty much ready to call the police, in walks Mary. And her mother says, "Where have you been?" And Mary's very, very, humble about it. She said, when I went out to put it in the garage, I heard somebody crying. And I walked to the sound of the crying. And when I saw where the crying was coming from, it was a little girl in my class that really doesn't like me. But she was crying so hard. And so I was with her. And the mother was like, "Oh my goodness, maybe all this religious education has paid off and you're generous and compassionate and so forth." So the mother said, so what did you do? Did you find out why she was crying? "Well, yes, I did. Her puppy died." Oh, and the mother said, "Oh, and did you, tell her that it would be okay?" And she said, "No." She said, "Did you take her to her mother because she was upset?" And Mary said, "No." She said, "Did you tell her that she could get another puppy?" And Mary said, "No." And the mother said, "Well, what did you do that you were gone so long?" And Mary just looked at her mother and she said, "She was crying really hard. And so I sat down next to her and helped her cry." Courage. That's a hallmark of a prophetic voice. Courage that is born from the ability to be with, to feel with, to listen to hurt with, to rejoice with, cry with, laughing with. And I apologize for the English majors who mind that they end with a preposition. But this capacity to actually be in that kind of relationship, courage that's born from that awareness, finds its authentic presence and its power as real life compassion. So if what we see in the prophet is courage, it's the kind of prophetic presence that we would like to bring if the courage is born of compassion. Because courage can be born of a lot of other things, you know. It could be born of anger, could be born of fear, could be born of retaliation, could be born of arrogance, could be born of a lot of things. Courage that's born from those qualities of relationship find their authentic presence as real life compassion. Second story. Grandmothers, elders. There's a wisdom in the elders that I think we can learn something from when we're trying to look for where is the prophet? Why is it that a prophet is not known even in her own town? What's the cost of being prophetic? I want to tell you a story about my own grandmother. This is not she, but my own grandmother. My own grandmother had many, many, many grandchildren. And every time you were with grandmom, you felt like you were the only grandchild in the whole world, much less the only grandchild that she had. And one of the things that grandmom used to do is sit with us. We always had tea and cookies. Everything always got okay when you had tea and cookies with grandma. And grandma was the one that you would go to, especially if you're the oldest in the family like I am, and would often get in a little bit of trouble because my younger siblings did something and my parents would say, you're the oldest, you should set a better example. So one time I was telling my grandmother about this story that happened to me in that way, and I got into a lot of trouble. Not because I did anything, but because I should have set a better example. So she just sat stirring her tea and making sure I had, enough sugar for my tea. Never said a word, just listened. At some points when I started to cry, she just kind of put her arm on my shoulder or patted my knee and just shook her head, never said a word, just shook her head like, go ahead, I'm listening. So finally I finished my tale of woe. And she just looked at me and she said, Carol Ann, you always got your full baptismal name with my grandmother. She said, Carol Ann, Grandma's going to tell you something. You have a chance in this situation to be as big as God wanted you to be on the day of your baptism. You have a chance in this situation to be as big as God wanted you to be on the day of your baptism. Grandmothers or elders know that every moment in the present is fully about the present, and whatever we do in that moment, it will contribute to the future. Grandmothers and elders know that everything that matters in life is in the present moment, and that how we engage that present moment will change the future for a long time to come. And we know our indigenous sisters and brothers have that same understanding. Everything they do is always in line with this next 7 generations. So what does that teach us? I think it has something to do with commitment to relationships that are able to sustain what we call the long haul, the long term. Those kind of relationships that are able to sustain that long haul kind of witness and wisdom, that flows from a life of contemplation. I'm not necessarily talking about the classical mystical contemplation here, because that makes everybody nervous. I'm talking about contemplation that is classical mystical, where we take a long, loving look at reality. That we're able to still ourselves like my grandmother, to listen deeply like my grandmother, to be present fully like my grandmother, to allow someone else who is in front of us sharing whatever they're sharing, let them do that. That capacity to be able to be that kind of presence, that contemplative capacity. When we are able to do that, commitment to relationships that are able to sustain the long haul witness and wisdom, even when everything's going against you, you can still stay committed to the gospel or to your values or whatever it might be. That kind of commitment only comes from a life of contemplation. Third story. Actually, I must tell you that I totally redid this reflection after last Friday, when Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. Because I think she's the woman in the third story that I'd like to raise up. We know about her that she was able to be very, very, very focused and very present at the same time. She was able to have relationships of meaning, as we say, across the aisle. Her friendship with Judge Scalia is legendary. The other thing that's legendary is the story that is told and now written about how she welcomed the new Chief Justice, Neil Gorsuch. Again, reaching across the aisle, welcoming him to the common good of tending to the Constitution in this country. The capacity for this woman to do this came from where? I would like to suggest that it came from her personal life. It came from her relationships. It came from her family, from her mother, who, as we now know, said to her many, many times, be a lady and be independent. That feels like an oxymoron. It came from her challenges around gender, challenges around roles, challenges around being a lone voice. It came from her MO, her modus operandi, where we now know she said many times, sometimes in conversations, you just have to pretend to be a little bit deaf. Or where she would always say to her clerks, keep your eyes on the end goal and the horizon of the common good made possible by the Constitution. It came from her capacity to maintain her principles and her relationships. So how did she do that? I think you've probably seen these Russian nested dolls. You know, you can get them in sets of 3, or you can get them in sets of, I don't know how many's here. I don't know, many. You can get them in sets of 60 and 80. I want you to look at that little tiny, tiny, tiny dot of wood at the end of the right-hand side of the screen there. When you stack all those dolls up, all of them are inside that largest doll. It's a great image of consciousness. The capacity that we humans have to think about what we think about. Not just to think, but to think about what we think about. And what we know is that we've got a lot of levels, if you will, of thinking about what we think about. Anything from being safe and secure to hanging out with, my own echo chamber of people in my tribal comfort, to growing to a stage of wanting to be self-determined, to realizing as we think about our thoughts, there has to be a higher order, if you will, to understand that we can accept it, we can be successful and we can achieve. And then at the end of the first tier of this consciousness, we have a sense of community. So we've got a capacity to keep growing our thinking, if you will, growing the capacity to think. Then the science tells us that after we kind of get to that first tier, end of the first tier, where all of a sudden we turn around and we say, oh, I'm not the only one here. I have a sense of others around me. The science, you might want to copy this down, it's very scientific language. The science says that humans take a leap of transformation, where they actually go across a space in their minds where they can think even larger. And this is second tier consciousness, where we begin to think, when we are thinking about things, that absolutely everything is connected. Everything is connected. My security is connected to yours. My sense of who I am to be self-determined is connected to yours. And then there's another meme or another level of thinking that humans are able to do, that every connection is interconnected. And there's even language now that every interconnection is integrated and holographic. It's very sophisticated thinking. Why do I say that? I say it because what I see in the story of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is conviction that came from consciousness. The conviction that is lived out loud in word, which she certainly did use, or deed. contributes to the meaning and purpose of all when it's grounded in a consciousness of depth and breadth and scope that's focused on the common good and the larger worldview. With such strong convictions, how would she be able to be in such a meaningful relationship with Justice Scalia, who also had very strong convictions from a very different perspective? How do you hold that kind of consciousness, or conviction rather, if you do not have the capacity to at least hear what someone else is thinking and seeing? That's consciousness that's writ large, when you are able to hold that capacity. And why can you do that? Well, I want to go back to the dolls for a minute. If safety and security is the most basal level of thinking, when we stack all those dolls up, no matter how big our thinking gets, that little concern about my safety and security is always with us. It never goes away. So in terms of the dolls, the larger doll is able to really relate in thinking to all the other levels because they're all in her. The opposite is not true. That little tiny doll can't even relate to the little one next to it. I think of that when I think of my grandmother saying, be as big as God wanted you to be on the day of your baptism. How does a prophet maintain that kind of capacity to speak a word of hope in a way that people can hear it? And Mike, when you said about not wanting to hear it, I think not wanting to hear it and really hearing it are two different things. So my three stories, I think, capture for me what really is ours to do. And I think what's ours to do is really develop compassion, because it's compassion that gives birth to the prophetic courage. To develop a life of contemplation, that still, silent, quiet way of taking a long, loving look. That allows the anger and the angst and the uncertainty and the anxiety to find another place to live in us. It's that kind of way of being that yields a commitment. And I think the third part is to develop to work on stretching our thinking, because it's consciousness that develops conviction. So visionary conversations, I think, are about courage and commitment and conviction. But the work is to focus, in this case, focus on women who practice living a life of deepening compassion, of deepening contemplation, and deepening consciousness. I think if we just look at women who express courage, commitment, and conviction, I think we're going to miss the point. The point is that those abilities, those skills, those gifts come from a very deep place. And if you're feeling a little nervous right now, maybe like this woman, well, that's probably good, because that's how prophets feel most of the time. They're never really quite sure. There's an incredible amount of risk that a prophetic voice, a prophetic stance takes. And this is even more risky. Did you notice the young woman on the tightrope at least has a little anchor around her foot, you know? This one's just kind of hanging out there, you know? But I think the words of T.S. Eliot are very helpful. Only those who will risk going too far in prophetic hope, too far in compassion, too far in contemplation, too far in consciousness. Only those who will risk going too far and possibly find out how far one can go. So I want to kind of leave you with an image that's very familiar to all of us, because really I think what prophets do is they themselves commit to a process of transformation, and then they live their life from such integrity of their own journey of transformation that that's what everybody else witnesses. That's the prophetic, is others are witnessing the kind of transformational journey that the prophet is on. This is a familiar example of transformation, metamorphosis. If anybody ever told you that this process was going to yield this, you wouldn't believe it. You know, it's talk about mystery, absolutely mystery. But the process, as it lays itself out, this scientifically, you can see the development. You can see, I'm going to use consciousness here. You can see the emergence. You can see the transformation. But this is the most important part of the transformational process, the metamorphosis. It's what happens in that silence, in the solitude, in the stillness that allows the actual metamorphosis to take place. And what happens in there, we know, is total letting go. All of the parts of the caterpillar are of no use to the butterfly. It all actually dies. And out of that, something else is born. The prophet knows that there's something in them that has to die. If they think that all the prophetic work is about them, we all know people who are like that, and they think they're prophets. As soon as you think you're a prophet, you're not. As soon as somebody tells you a prophet, you want to just really run away as far as you can and go on a 190-day retreat or something, just to do your own examen of consciousness. You don't want people telling you, oh, you're prophetic, because if that happens, you want to really kind of pay attention to where is that witness that people are seeing. Where is it coming from? And if it's coming from Carol Zinn or Mary Smith or Kathleen or Mike, you can be pretty sure that it might be all right in terms of, not being bad, but it's probably not the kind of authentic prophetic voice that the world needs right now. So this kind of living, this kind of commitment to these compassionate relationships, to this contemplative stance towards life, and to this openness to allow our thinking to emerge, to change, to be transformed. This kind of living will make the prophetic and the political. It will make it personal and peripheral. There will not be a separation between them. It will be so one that when I'm walking around in my apartment by myself, I have the same manner of presence and the same consciousness and the same way of being in relationship as I do when I walk out my door into the more public arena. And this kind of living will make the personal and peripheral become prophetic and political. So we have to be careful and not bifurcate this, that all of a sudden I'm going to be politically engaged and speak a prophetic word, when my personal interior and external life is very far away from compassion, contemplation, and consciousness. So my 3 stories: Mary, who sat down and helped her friend, who really was not her friend. She wasn't nice to her in school, but she sat down and she helped her cry. My grandmother and many elders. You have a chance in this very challenging situation to be as big as God wanted you to be on the day of your baptism. And Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a life that lived out loud when it was with us and is living out even louder now that it is no longer here. That kind of impact, that kind of presence, I think is what the world needs. And it's what we really need to do as women and men, as people of faith, as people living at this moment in time in our own country, as well as in the world, within our faith traditions and churches. We are being called on, I think, to really develop lives of compassion, contemplation, and consciousness, because the courage and the commitment and the conviction that will be born from that way of life will in fact speak a word of hope. So as Carrie Newcomer said at the beginning, I want you just to remember those words. We're not going to listen to it again. But if not now, tell me when. If we are not going to take this on as a way of life, when will we do it? And if we do it, as she says in that song, if we do it so that we reach the promised land, or we see the effect of the transformation. It's going to be a very difficult journey. We have to do now what is ours to do for the future that most of us will more than likely not even see. So my dear sister and friend Mara, I am eager to listen to you and to engage in conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Carol. For the last 45 minutes, we've all had the pleasure of thinking with Sister Carol about the practices, compassion, contemplation, and consciousness that generate a set of dispositions in us: courage, commitment, and conviction. This combination of practices and dispositions open the possibility of a prophetic way of being. And although she just said she would go off on a 190-day retreat if somebody said this about her, I want to say in her way of being, Sister Carol models what it looks like to be prophetic. And she encourages us in our own capacity to be prophetic as well. I'm honored to offer the response to this inspiring talk. And I've decided to approach my time as a true respondent. In other words, I'm operating from the perspective of one who has heard a prophet speak. I should also say that my response comes as a Catholic theologian. So to this end, I've titled my talk, Hearing the Voice of the Prophet. I follow Sister Carol not only structurally as a responder to a prophet, but also in her decidedly catchy alliterative approach, or I guess it's actually consonation, because it's 3 consonants she gives us. And I'm going to add 3 C's of my own to the mix: cognitive dissonance, conversion, and community. These overlap with what Sister Carol said, but maybe I'll offer something new by pulling them into focus in a distinctive way. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance, we know, arises when we become aware of a break between new information and what we thought we knew. These experiences can be painful because we're forced to rethink of ourselves and our world. They're also enormously powerful. From experiences of cognitive dissonance, we are able to learn, to invent, and to imagine new possibilities. The great American philosopher John Dewey theorized that all education depends on cognitive dissonance, although he didn't use that term. He talked about this phenomena as disequilibrium. And I would have too, except I really needed a word that started with C. When we encounter a new idea or new information, it generates a problem in the stasis. Our equilibrium is thrown off, and we're thrown into a state of disequilibrium. It's inherently uncomfortable, but it's also the only way that we can incorporate new data into our way of thinking. It's fundamentally an invitation to new possibility. Prophetic voices generate cognitive dissonance and disequilibrium. They often rupture a sense of who I take myself to be. Now, in our moment of widespread social reckoning over race and racial injustice, I keep thinking about the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah was commissioned at a young age to serve God, and the Lord set 2 baskets of figs before Jeremiah. He tells Jeremiah, one basket is good and the other is bad. As to the good figs, thus says the Lord. Like these good figs, so I will regard as good the exiles from Judah. I will set up my eyes upon them for good, and I will bring them back to this land. I will build them up and not tear them down. I will plant them and not pluck them. I will give them a heart to know that I am the Lord, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God, for they shall return to me with their whole heart. As to the bad figs, Jeremiah says, thus says the Lord. Like the bad figs that are so bad they cannot be eaten, so I will treat the remnant of Jerusalem who remain in this land. I will make them a horror, an evil thing to all the kingdoms of the earth, a disgrace, a byword, a taunt, a curse. In all the places I shall drive them, and I will send sword, famine, and pestilence upon them until they are utterly destroyed from the land that I gave to them and their ancestors. Leaving aside the specific content of the promises and the punishments that Jeremiah prophesies, I want to put our focus on who is good and who is bad, and why that matters for us today. The context matters a lot. Jeremiah preaches during a time immediately before and after the fall of Jerusalem. This is a major event in Jewish history, the time when the Israelites are driven out of their homeland into Babylonia. Everything that they had built and known was destroyed. God's message vis-a-vis Jeremiah is that those who stayed are damned and those who exiled are good. This is a real head scratcher. Why would it be that the Israelites who remained in the land that God blessed them with in the first place will now be punished? And rewarded will be those who were sent out, who were forced to leave behind the home given to them by the Lord? What gives? As always, God upends our expectations. The message seems to be something like this. The remnant, God says, Israelites, you think just being here is enough? It's not. You've gotten too comfortable. You are resting too surely on your presumed proximity to me. You will be punished. To the exiles, God says, you left the promised land. And in your new place, you have continually strived and imagined new ways to know me. The prophet Jeremiah generates a sense of cognitive dissonance, I think especially for the remnant, for the Israelites who stayed. I would imagine they felt like they were doing well enough just by virtue of their position. This made them uncomfortable, but hopefully it also generated new possibilities. Again, our current moment of social reckoning with race and racial injustice is very much on my mind, as it is for many of us. For me, it's easy to be like the remnant Jeremiah spoke to believe that my ethic, my morality, my good way of being, my position are all enough. And I am absolved of taking further responsibility and action against the injustice of the world. But no, Jeremiah and the prophetic voices of our time dare us to be more like the exiles, to not assume anything about things being as they should, to actively work, strive, and imagine new possibilities. I think the challenge for us in this age is to hear the voices around us as possibly prophetic. Perhaps especially the voices that we want to turn away from because they make us uncomfortable, because they critique and challenge. We must listen for the prophetic calls around us and learn to tune in to our sneaking experiences of cognitive dissonance and to not back down from them. If we are to make this world more reflective of God's justice and merciful way of being, we must first be ready to feel cognitive dissonance, to let there be a rupture between who we take ourselves to be and what the prophet reveals about who we are. It is a challenge to rightly discern the "thus says the Lord" moments. How can we learn to recognize them? When we accept that a message is prophetic, we are called to respond and to act. We are called to a life of conversion. Notice I don't say we ought to convert, but instead we are called to a life of conversion. This important distinction is drawn best, I think, by the great feminist theologian and prophetic voice herself, Sally McFaig. McFaig has a landmark essay titled "Conversion, Life on the Edge of the Raft." And it's the kind of piece that you keep coming back to over and again. It's the kind of piece that when you teach theology, you pretty much assign it in any class you teach, just because you want students to encounter it. Conversion, McFaig tells us, is a lifelong journey, wherein we pass over to a new orientation to reality, where we stand open to the surprising and unexpected. Conversion is not a one and done kind of thing. Instead, it's an ongoing process. Saying that conversion has a protracted rather than instantaneous quality isn't McFaig's only contribution. She also reminds us of the nature of conversion and indeed the demand of living as a Christian. We find out what the converted life is by looking at the Gospels and specifically the parables. Parables were Jesus's preferred way of teaching, we know. He didn't speak in them to offer his audience reassurance, but instead as a powerful tool to challenge everything his audience thought they knew. The parables subverted his audience's expectations. They were disorienting, much like it's disorienting to stand under the bean in downtown Chicago and look up. McFays calls parables an assault on the conventional perspective and way of thinking. To truly hear a parable is to let oneself be disoriented by it. Because he taught in parables, we know that Jesus asks for us to be disoriented, to have what we know be subverted. In line with this, McFay characterizes the converted life, the Christian life, as life on the edge of a raft. The image we should conjure up here, according to McFay, is not one of peacefully floating along in calm waters. Christ does not call us to relax and be comfortable. No, Christ calls us to be courageous, to be willing to risk and suffer, to live lives of dis-ease and spiritual adventure that is unsettling, if not terrifying, to contemplate. Conversion is much less this than it is this. Like the whitewater rafters, conversion doesn't result in comfort. We don't get peace, rest, and security from converting. Instead, we are put in dangerous waters, and we are always just on the edge, vulnerable daily to God. For my final C, I want to think about community. However we respond to the prophetic voice, however we make ourselves vulnerable daily to God, we do so in the company and fellowship of others. We do so in community. I've been thinking back to the beginning of the pandemic, to that time 7 months ago, and what tremendous courage it took for all of us to confront and move through that time of total uncertainty and utter vulnerability. How did we get through that time? How do we continue to get through this time? I have a short story to illustrate a kind of answer to this question. Just a few months before the pandemic struck, my husband and I brought our third child home from the hospital. When the pandemic came, we, like everyone, were afraid. Could we manage a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 3-month-old on our own, working full time? What if one of us got sick? We decided to leave our apartment in Chicago and go stay with my parents in Pennsylvania for as long as it would take. I remember on one of the very first nights when we got there, we finally got the kids settled in their sleeping bags and the baby put down on his bassinet. And exhausted and disoriented by our new situation, my husband and I fell asleep too. Probably a half hour passed, and we heard a little pitter patter of feet and the first little voice, "Mom, can I sleep in this room with you?" Not long after, a second pitter patter of feet and a tiny voice, "Me too? Yes, yes, of course." So now the perimeter of our bed is fully flanked by sleeping children. The room isn't all that big, and it's growing stuffy and hot with 5 breathing bodies. I lay there, listening to the grunts and moans and sniffles and deep breaths of life. And the lyrics of a John Prine song arose in my mind. Surround me with your boundless love. Confound me with your boundless love. Why those song lyrics at that moment? Because I suggest in my awareness of deep communion at that moment, I knew God, which is also to say that I knew boundless love. And here again, enter another great feminist theologian, Catherine Mowry LaCugna, to help elucidate the point. The critical insight of the Christian doctrine of God LaCugna teaches is that relatedness, not autonomy, is primary, and all existence derives from God as communion. This is the message of the Trinity. God is perfect relation, and we are called to live in that perfect relation. I think in my own life about who has taught me best about communion and community. Certainly, it's not the exclusive province of women, but at least in my own experience, it is women, my mother, my grandmothers, my 7 aunts, my sister, my closest friend, Bridget. I could go on. These are the people who are the masters of communion. They not only teach me how to create and live in community, but In so doing, they teach me also, therefore, who God is. When we hear the voice of the prophet, it should disturb us, and it should call us to a life of conversion. While the converted life isn't a life of comfort and ease, but instead one of courage and dis-ease, it's also the case that the converted life is first and foremost a life in community. We may be on the edge of the raft, yes, but we're not alone there. And in fact, maybe more to the point, by fully living a life in community, we put ourselves on the edge of the raft. We make ourselves vulnerable daily to God. I conclude with this beautiful and challenging statement, articulated by Catherine Mowry Lacuna. To take on and live in the name of God is bold and radical. Thank you, Sister Carol, for provoking these thoughts in me and for giving me the opportunity to respond. And thank you to all you participants for thinking alongside me.
Well, thank you very much to both of our speakers. On my screen, I'm pixelating, so Megan's gonna let me know if I'm coming through. And I'm coming through?
Yes.
Oh, good. So I can suffer with my own narcissism from my own office. You know, amazingly resonant for me. Sister Carol, would you like to respond to Dr. Brecht, Mara's insights in any way, in a brief way?
Oh my goodness. Oh my God, really, Mara, just absolutely profound to take. I think the balance of what we offered together, what you took with the cognitive dissonance and the conversion, that the image of the white water rafting, it was just so profound. That is what the prophet's life looks like and feels like and is. But the beauty of doing it in community, and that relatedness is primary. That's very much at the core of any of the prophetic traditions, that the prophet is never about itself and never calling attention to itself. I cannot thank you enough. Absolutely. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much.
Feeling well nourished from you both, and so I wanted to second the thank you. Megan is going to join me. Megan's been collecting questions. I just want to remind everybody, if you haven't used that Zoom functionality, it can be a little bit foreign, that you click on the Q&A and you type away. But that's your portal into commenting or asking a question. But we have some. And so I'd like to invite Megan. Megan is our center manager, but Megan's also dissertating. She's a doctoral student in theology, working on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And so Megan, please join us. And what are you seeing on the Q&A?
I'm going to give you a few questions that we've had come in. One from an audience member, and this is specifically in response, Sister Carol, to your presentation. The question is, are you saying that everyone by their baptism is to become a prophet? Before we answer that, I'm going to give you some that we received ahead of time before the program began, and I imagine these are for these. Love to hear the perspective of both Sister Carol and Mara on these questions. What influence do lay women have to challenge the many bishops' singular focus on abortion? A very well-stated question that simply says, women deacons, ? And then this question got a little cut off, but I think we can get the gist of it. With the many public protests for equality in our country for all races, when do you think the church will consider equality for, and it got cut off at that point. And we have a final question that speaks really to a more personal side here. What idea or insight have you kept returning to in a way that is clarifying or nourishing for you in this pandemic? Sister Carol, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Really, just absolutely wonderful questions. Thank you. So the question, am I saying that, by our baptism, that we're called to be prophets. I don't know that I'm saying that. I think what I am saying is that our baptism makes us prophets. We are baptized into the priesthood, the prophecy, and the kingship of Jesus Christ. So if you're baptized, then the answer is yes. But I think what's important there is to understand what's meant by that. And to the priesthood of Christ is that it's not about ordination. It's about being set apart, if you will, for ministry and for service, kind of identified as a servant. The prophetic piece is that's what I draw on in my reflection tonight, to speak this word of hope, even when everything around you absolutely defies that there's any kind of hope at all. And the reason Jesus was able to do that is because of his kingship, into which we're also baptized. Kingship meaning the life of Jesus was never about himself. It was always about the reign of God. His horizon was beyond him. And so the short answer to that question is yes. But I'm not saying that it seems that we have to be a prophet. I'm saying that our baptism baptizes us into the priesthood, prophecy, and kingship of Jesus Christ. You want me to continue, or Mara and I, do you want to come in here, a little conversation?
Sure, that sounds good. Let's see, the other questions were about women deacons, equality. Yeah, I think, well, this isn't much of an answer, but one thing the prophet doesn't do is forecast the future. And I mean, so if being the prophetic is speaking a word of hope and not trying to forecast the future, I suppose I would, I continue to try to be in my teaching and writing and thinking and own membership in the Catholic Church to try to be a person of hope and to be hopeful about a time when women will share in full leadership. But I don't know that I have a way to forecast that. Sister Carol?
Yeah, I think actually the next set of questions about the single issue of abortion for our brother bishops and for many of our Catholic brothers and sisters and other Christians and people of other faiths, the question about women deacons and the question about equality for, and I'm almost happy that the words weren't there because fill in the blank, equality for people of color, equality for women, equality for LGBT community, equality. So I think I'm with you, Mara, in that I'm not about to, predict the future. That's not the role of a prophet. What I do see, though, in terms of, a word of hope being spoken, I think the kind of at the end of the continuum of feminism and, women's reproductive rights and women being able to participate in all 7 sacraments, I think that the end of that continuum is the anger, which is a really wonderful gift to us. And it sounds like, why can't women be ordained? That fire is necessary, and there's a prophetic role to keep that fire burning. I think, though, what I'm beginning to understand is that perhaps the word of hope is the understanding that ordination is not about gender. It's much deeper than that. It's really about power. Because in the construct of our church, whom we love, in that construct, all of the decision-making is tied to ordination. And when only 1% of the Catholic population is ordained, what does that mean for the other 99% of all of us, I presume, on this call even, who are laity? Point. I think the prophetic word that's rising is the gender conversation about ordination is probably, it's helpful, but it's not the real conversation. And I think that takes me right to the abortion being the single issue for bishops and then equality for fill in the blank. You know, when you start pulling on a thread of a sweater, the whole thing unravels. And so to really engage in the conversation within our church about what does it mean to be ordained? What does it mean to have the power of decision making? What does it mean to make decisions about others without others? It all becomes part of a kind of a ball of twine, you know. But I think the prophetic work is to keep raising the questions. Absolutely, to keep raising the questions and to get more clear about what the real question is. You know, the certainly right to life. I mean, who of us is not supportive of right to life? You know, and what is meant by that when that gets articulated as the preeminent priority, even raised up for this election season? It is the preeminent priority. What does that mean? Those kinds of questions and conversations are well worth the time, I think. And I think the prophetic work is to keep raising that up, much like Pope Francis did in his statement where he did kind of return to Cardinal Bernardine's seamless garment. You know, right to life is right to life. It's not the same as right to be born. Those are two different realities. And so I think these questions are the work of the prophet, to be able to speak a word of hope without forecasting the future or giving an answer.
That's insightful, Sister Carol. Mara, do you want to follow up on any of those points? You're muted, Mara.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
No, I don't think any of those points in particular. I was just looking in the chat window about, can you give a few examples of how one could give this word of hope? So I think I hear the kind of tension emerging, like, yeah, we get it. We want hopefulness, but what about all of these difficult things in our tradition? And I think I just wish this were a class right now, because what I would do is just turn it back to the students in the class and say, well, in your own life, how do you demonstrate hope? What have, and not as a challenge, but as a way of kind of summoning one's own strength, like think about the ways that you have given those around you hope. And I always talk about my role as a teaching theology at the college level as I relish the opportunity to restore students' hope in the possibility of Christianity. I don't assume that my students are traditioned or Christian or ever will be, but I want them to see the richness of the tradition, and I think to learn the most fundamental basic truth, which is what I articulated in my talk, that God is a community of perfect relation. And when we begin from there, we can find that many of the debates and disagreements that we have can distract us from that truth. That's not to say that they're not really important, but that we have a place that we can always return to. And that place, that God is a community of perfect relation, is what nourishes us in the face of so much challenge, in the face of so much injustice, in the face of what would otherwise be hopelessness. So I hope that doesn't sound like a Pollyanna-ish kind of answer. That's just what I keep coming back to in my own life of faith.
You know, I think too, Mara, as you say that, I think of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I mean, when you think about her story, now after she graduated top of her class and not one law firm would hire her, you know, and then that kind of theme, you know, continued. I think that's what I meant when I said, when I was sharing about the need to have an inner space for the long haul. This prophetic work is not short-term quick fix, you know, and I think what we see in her is that kind of commitment. That's what we see in elders, as you said, Mara, with your grandmother and your aunts. You know, we see in some of those people who are prophetic, that capacity within them to be able to hold that kind of tension and not yield and not walk away. How do you find that sweet spot? And I think in faith language and the mystical life, that sweet spot is a very deep contemplative space? How many of her clerks have said that she was so quiet? I mean, and every word was measured. You didn't get any ums and ahs and well, I think, and that's an incredible amount of self-discipline. I think the characteristic of self-discipline for our prophetic work these days, it's being tested. You know, I don't know about you, but it's tested when I look at my television and nobody's talking, everybody's screaming over each other, you know. How to get under that. That's the work of the prophet, is to be able to really see what is the word that needs to be spoken here.
I think, you know, I'm just energized by these insights. Again, I said that, but I'll say it again. You know, the other distractions, this is the age of distraction. There was always TV, but we have hyper amplified distractions that, you know, screen addictions, screen oppressions that take our attention away from contemplation. And we need our contemplation. Think of Justice Ginsburg and think of Justice Scalia, right? Very different. They both loved the Constitution. And my guess is they both loved, as you say, Justice Ginsburg did, but Scalia, I'm sure, loved contemplation. They also both loved opera, which probably meant that they could handle, they understood drama, and they understood, you know, when it was dramatic and when to leave it be. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to, before I ask Megan what other questions that she's seeing, I want to also celebrate, I guess maybe a prophet is known in her town when you think of Sister Norma Pimentel, who is one of Time's 100 People of the Year. And I want to applaud our Loyola grad, Sister Norma, for that great work. So just wanted to put that out there for our community. Megan, what else are you seeing in the Q&A?
We have a question here. Can you say something about the situation of women of color, undocumented women who cannot speak up because their lives are in danger? What responsibilities does that put on the rest of us?
I think that this is maybe a little bit what I was trying to get at in my first discussion around cognitive dissonance, which is essentially that I can't operate from the premise that what I'm doing is good enough, that my way of being as, let's say, a so-called good white person is going to change anything or is adequately responding to the situation of racial injustice. And so I think that the women of color, undocumented women, they are in some sense a prophetic presence to me. That's a thus says the Lord moment. When I read about and listen to and witness to the pain and suffering of women on the margins, that has to disrupt my sense of what I'm doing is enough. And I think that we all in our own ways in life respond to injustice, or we have the opportunity to. For myself as a teacher, this is a central area of my teaching, to take up questions around race and whiteness and privilege and all those sorts of things, and to ask students to journey with me, to raise the questions so that then there's an effect outward. They make changes. They think about their own identities and their power and capacities to respond to injustice. So the short answer is that I think that the presence of women on the margins is a thus says the Lord moment that ought to be disruptive to me.
Mara, thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. I had the privilege of ministering for 13 years at the United Nations. And every March, the United Nations holds the Commission on the Status of Women. And the first time that I went to that meeting, I will never forget my experience of, I think it was conversion. It was certainly shock and cognitive dissonance. I hope to God it was some level of conversion in my consciousness and heart. But I heard my sisters of color from all around the world say to people that look like me, the conversation about sexism is a white middle-class woman's hobby. You have no idea what it means to be a woman and then to be a woman of color. And so I agree with the way you just said that, Mara, that I think the witness that we allow our sisters of color and all of our undocumented brothers and sisters, the witness that we allow them to be, if we allow them to be the witness to us, it will be very unnerving, very unsettling. It will put us on the edge of the raft. And that's why I think we have all the pushback. I think intuitively, the human consciousness knows that this issue, this person, this conversation, this challenge is going to turn my world upside down. And we resist it. That's why I think the work on consciousness is so important. We have got to be open to having our thinking stretched. And if we don't want to do that, then any effort at trying to be faithful to our baptismal commitment to priest, prophet, and king, it is all going to be disingenuous, and we will have no integrity, either in our faith life or in our human relationships. So I appreciate how you said that. To perhaps the person who asked that question, I don't know what it sounds like that is helpful to you, because it sounds like you're helpful to somebody like me, and I want to acknowledge that. But I think we need to walk together. We need to ask you to let us walk with you and talk with you and learn from you and be with you. To maybe do nothing else except to sit down on the curb and cry with you. Maybe that's the start of trying to be open to what is this mirror that's being held up to us in our country at this moment in time, where women and women of color and undocumented brothers and sisters of ours, the issues just keep on happening. What are we looking at as we look out at our country? It's a real challenge.
Thank you. Another question about a very current issue and a crisis. COVID has put an enormous strain on community in liturgy together, in service to one another, given social distancing, and in distancing our elders. What is ahead in recovering ground we have lost?
I think, one thing that I have talked about with many friends and mentors, and I know this thought is on a lot of people's minds, is that one thing we should not do after COVID is go back to the way things were. Like, in some ways, our lives have become more slowed down. There's more space for contemplation and reflection. And can we move forward in the future with what we have learned from this? I don't have an answer for what is ahead in terms of liturgy and worship or anything in life, but I think I would want to emphasize that we get to be the decision makers about that. We get to form communities of conversation, and we get to decide how we want to be in the world. Does that mean that we get to change the liturgies at our churches or in the church, capital R, capital C, Roman Catholic? Not necessarily, but I think that we can, to use the language that Sister Carol used, we can contemplate and have consciousness about the way that we want to be in the future, including in our worship. So for myself, I reflect on those questions, and I think about what does it mean now that I haven't taken my children to Mass with me in 7 or 8 months? What are we going to look like on the other side of this? What values am I going to emphasize? And I have a sense of agency about that. I can be a decision maker about what my future world looks like, or I can take responsibility for it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think, first of all, we've all heard, there's try to get back to normalcy, or return to normal. And we've also heard that there will be no return to what was before. I mean, the social sciences tell us that you need 90 days to break a habit. We've had more than 90 days. And whatever was before February or March in this part of the world, it is gone. And it has made me reflect on what I thought was normal before COVID. When I think of my own pace of my life, I canceled 37 flights because of COVID. Who in their right mind has 37 flights over 4 months? And it was all ministry. I wasn't going on vacation anywhere, so it was all good, you know. It wasn't normal before COVID, you know. I'm not sure worship was normal. I'm not sure the way we were in relationship with each other was normal before COVID. You know, so I'm with you, Mara. I have no idea what the future will look like. But I do think that our faith life, our family life, our social lives, education, healthcare, right across all the sectors, it's an opportunity for it all to be recreated. And I love your language of agency, you know. I think, for example, I think in terms of worship, since that was the lead part of the question, and liturgy in particular, I think there are many people of all faith traditions who have found their way to another way of being part of a worshiping community. And I know I've heard some of my friends, even my family members, say, you know, I was feeling that I was just kind of watching liturgy anyhow on Sunday. Now I'm really just watching it. And I realized that it's not a spectator sport. I want something else. So, you know, when parishes open up again, I'm really not sure what that's going to look like or mean, and where the faith community is really going to find itself, you know.
Mara, do you want to follow up on that? That's very rich. You are muted, Mara. No, good, thank you.
Sorry about
no problem. Yeah.
I don't know that I have any more insights beyond what Sister Carol offered. I just come back to, I have to take responsibility for what a new life looks like in the future. And I ought to be in conversation with mentors and friends and prophets about what that looks like.
Great. You know, I remember when I taught high school some years ago that we changed the schedule for the students, that we gave a Wednesday morning late start. And the idea was people can get their lives together and have some rest time. Well, you know, we didn't hear the spirit in that. What did we do? We started having meetings in that time, filling up the space. So I don't know if we're listening to follow you, Sister Carol, that the Spirit's trying to tell us something, maybe through COVID. Of course, you know, it's not like puppeteering with all the suffering and people dying. That's not what I mean. But will we learn? Will we learn? Will we take the time and, you know, use our imagination? The prophet always has an imagination that's really at work. So that's my 2 cents. Megan, do you have any thoughts on this yourself from your point of view?
Well, I actually think that I'd love to share another question from the audience that I think dialogues well with what's with what's taking place in this conversation, and it's about future looking. And the question is, what would it tangibly look like to dismantle clericalism and restore effective decision-making power / voices to the laity, and especially to women? Or is imagining something so tangible not a direct part of the prophetic mission?
Megan, I have a thought on this because it's something I actually learned from you, a conversation, in a conversation, Megan and I are part of a working group together. And I think the place to begin with dismantling clericalism is dismantling it in oneself. And I mean, maybe we can broaden the idea of clericalism, but dismantling just hierarchicalism. And I'm going to just keep coming back to the Trinity because that's where my theology is. That's what Trinitarian theology is, that no one is the principle of any other. That is the beauty and the mystery and the insight that the Church Fathers worked out metaphysically, that it's a mystery of perfect relation. So I begin the work of dismantling clericalism by doing the work of quieting the voices that suggest that there is somebody who's a principal over me, or that I'm a principal over another. And maybe that's a contemplative practice. Resting one's eyes on the Trinity and trying to live into that mystery. I'm sure that there are strategies and tactics, and there should be strategies and tactics for dismantling clericalism in the church. But I mean, I think maybe I've just been so fully converted by what Sister Carol had to say, but this idea that we enter ourselves. We start with entering ourselves and doing the interior work that then allows us and energizes us to do the peripheral work, the work on the outside.
Yeah, thanks, Mara. I really appreciate that. And really glad you went first. I guess when I hear the word dismantle, because of the horror that's happening in the country around racial unrest, even as late as today, you know, with Brianna, dismantling white privilege. I think it and dismantling clericalism and dismantling patriarchy and dismantling, you know, whatever other construct you can think of. I think the core of it is the same. I think we first of all have to realize, all of us, you know, that we have to do our own inner work first and foremost, because I'm sure there's somebody in my life, in some deep part of my consciousness, that I either was taught or breathed in by osmosis that I'm better than, or that I'm smarter than. I mean, for example, I've got a terminal degree. Isn't that an interesting descriptor of a doctorate, a terminal degree, you know? 7 out of 10 people on the planet can't read. 6 of those 7 are women. I've got 4 degrees. I have so benefited by the system that I can't see it. And I think that goes for the educational power. It goes for the ordination power. It goes for the power of people who look like all of us on the screen that I'm looking at, because there's no white people, you know. If you saw somebody coming at you the shade of a piece of copy paper, you go running in the other direction. You know, there's no white people. There's only people of color and people like most of us in this conversation of no color. My point is that dismantling, whatever it is, the work is the dismantling, not whatever the topic is. And sometimes I think it's easier, at least it is for me, it's easier to try to dismantle something that I don't think that I'm causing. So I have been just faced front with dismantling white privilege, because that is my issue, because I am part of what creates that system of racism. However, to the point of dismantling clericalism, you know, quite honestly, the song by Leonard Cohen keeps ringing in my ears and heart. Anthem, you know, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. There's a crack in our institutional church. And it was before COVID. There's a crack in the way our culture in this country is constructed. There's a crack in our education system, our health system. There's a crack in Washington, D.C. and lots of other places. Somehow or other, I believe that all of those cracks, that it's the work of the faith community and perhaps the prophetic work to look at what is the light that is being let in for me, first and foremost. And then, as you said, Mara, when we're in a community that's looking for that light, we will know what the next step is in terms of dismantling clericalism, racism, sexism, whatever it might be. But in the meantime, I think, as my friend Margaret Wheatley, the change theory person, says, we are living in a time of collapse, institutional, structural Western collapse. And 4 years ago, she said at a talk, it is going to get worse before it gets better. And I think that's the truth of a prophet who stands and looks at reality and is really able to name what the reality, if you can't name the reality, you cannot speak the hope. You have got to name the reality first before you speak the hope.
That's great. Thank you both so much. I think that's probably a good spot for us to ask both our wonderful presenters if they have any closing words, any last thoughts to add before we wrap up.
Just thank
Thank
you
you.
for this invitation, and thank you, Sister Carol.
I was just going to say the same thing. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much, Mara.
Just a round of applause here as I can in my Brady Bunch square. So thank you both very much. Thank you, Megan and Kathleen, for your expertise and your help, in getting this going. Tomorrow's going to be a wonderful day, a full day. I have so many things written down here. I didn't do any live tweeting, but I should have. But maybe I'll take my notes as a live tweet tomorrow, because there's so many gems that you've given us, you both, and I want to thank you for your wisdom, and I want to thank you for your time. So tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. start. That's like the Zoom thing. We're trying to include our friends from the West, so at a reasonable hour. That's why things are kind of pushed back. So it might hurt the people in the East, but we do so to help the people in the West. There it is. Okay. We'll see you tomorrow. How about that? A round of applause in your heart. God bless you and keep you in good health. And let us care for one another and care for the most vulnerable among us always and first. Amen. Good night.